5 years after the polarizing follow-up to the game that put this series on the map, Monster Hunter Rise has garnered an astonishingly positive reputation as one of the best Monster Hunter games, despite its reception at launch. So I wanted to go back and take a closer look at this game to see if it actually deserves all that retroactive praise. And what I found when I did was combat that's far deeper than most people realize, possibly the best Monster Hunter story we've seen in over a decade, and ideas that I had never even considered in a Monster Hunter game. So join me as we analyze the most interesting and misunderstood entry in the series, in an attempt to gather what most people, myself included, missed in Monster Hunter Rise. I'd like to begin with a question. What makes a Monster Hunter game a Monster Hunter game? What's the one mechanic, trend, or general idea that you think defines this series? Is it the slow and methodical combat? Maybe the preparation and set building used to overcome these larger-than-life behemoths that you encounter? You may even believe that Monster Hunter is defined by its sense of community and how it can bring people together in the pursuit of one single goal. All of these are valid answers, but what makes Monster Hunter so interesting as a series, at least to me, is the fact that each and every game is defined by something slightly different. While they all have the same core principles, the series tends to almost reinvent itself with each entry. Let me give you a few examples. Monster Hunter Generations was a game with 4 unique hunting styles that totally changed the way you approached combat. Guild style was traditional combat, Adept let you dodge through attacks and counter, Striker gave you access to multiple arts and slightly faster charge time on those arts, and Aerial allowed you to soar through the sky with a focus on knocking the monster down for mounts. Each of the 14 weapons came with multiple of those aforementioned arts that acted like special attacks that you could use to do a variety of things. They allowed you to dodge out of harm's way, buff yourself in the party, automatically hit the subscribe button on great videos, or deliver one exceptionally powerful swing. Generations, much like all the previous games in the series, had a very distinct look to its graphics. The game was developed on the 3DS, and so it had to prioritize a more saturated, imaginative style over photorealism. All of this together created an over-the-top, dynamic, and almost cartoonish feel, and that feeling defined Monster Hunter Generations. The very next game in the series was Monster Hunter World, a game defined by its living world, environmental interactions, and photorealistic graphics. World was, and in my opinion still is, the most graphically impressive Monster Hunter game. The focus here was on creating an experience that would put the world itself at the forefront, hence the title. Hunting was a major part of this game as well. Gone were the days of stumbling through loading screens until the monster you were searching for showed up. Now you had to find signs of where that monster might be, things like footprints, clumps of fur, old scales, or fallen feathers. World also brought with it a greater focus on story. This could be seen right out of the gate with a cutscene that had you and your fleet just talking about the new world and what kind of things you might discover there. You're then interrupted when a monster the size of a small mountain capsizes your boat, forcing you and your handler to navigate the new world on foot until arriving at your destination. There were sections like this where you'd just walk around observing the new world that your fleet was sent over to study throughout the whole game. The cinematic turf wars further emphasized this idea of the world itself being fundamentally out of control. These hunts weren't one-on-one showdowns against a single opponent with clear and strict rules. They were chaotic and unpredictable expeditions into an unstable environment with danger around every corner. That immersion, sense of scale, and greater focus on the hunting aspect than anything else defined Monster Hunter World. Just looking at these two games alone, we can quickly see how dramatically different this series gets in each entry. Granted, you could say, well, that difference only exists because World was the first New World Monster Hunter game, and you'd be partially correct. The difference between any of these games and any of these are greater than the difference between any two games within the same group, yet we can still see a dramatic difference in any two entries in the series. 4 didn't have hunting styles and arts like Generations. Wilds had a fully open and interconnected world, and this one was underwater for some reason. That's just what this series does, and I'm willing to bet that it's a large part of why these games have not merely performed well, but have consistently grown with nearly every entry. It's this willingness to take what worked in the last entry, refine it a bit, and try something new that led to World's explosive success in the first place. So circling back to that initial question of what defines a Monster Hunter game, we can see that while the fundamental structure of each game is similar, they all revolve around that same loop of fight monsters and make gear. Each one has vastly different aspects to it that define the individual entry. Now, I say all of this because there's this idea that Rise is the first experimental game in the series, and that could not be further from the truth. Yet this is often used to label Rise as some kind of black sheep or unconventional spin-off. But again, that simply doesn't match reality. And in fact, as we delve deeper into this game, we'll start to see that in a lot of ways, Rise is more similar to the older generation of games than recent entries like World and Wilds. That all raises an obvious question though. What exactly does Rise change? And perhaps more importantly, do these changes actually make the game better? The gameplay of Monster Hunter Rise revolves around 4 key changes. 2 of these changes contribute to the same goal, while the 3rd and 4th have a separate goal that's been slowly and gradually reinventing the series. I'd like to begin with the first 2, starting with scale. It doesn't exactly take a rocket scientist to see that the maps in Rise are smaller than those in World, and while part of this is due to the Switch's limited capabilities, that's not really the primary reason. Even if Nintendo had more black magic than they currently do and somehow created a Switch as powerful as a modern supercomputer back in 2017, Rise probably still would have had a smaller scale than World. In an interview back in 2021, series producer Ryozo Sugimoto claimed that Rise was supposed to be an experience where, quote, you could casually pick up the game and do a quest in your spare time, end quote. In World, the goal was to get lost in these environments and spend hours just wandering around. In Rise, the goal was to trim out the slower parts of the game and focus purely on combat. That's why I say that even with a super console, the game's scale probably would have been around the same as it is now. Furthering this more streamlined agenda is what you could call quality of life. This is a more broad term that applies to a dozen smaller changes that all aim to do the same thing. Rise removed hot and cool drinks, they added the pause button back to single player, you no longer have to track monsters and their locations are always displayed on the map at the start of a hunt. Palamutes let you zoom through areas and quickly scale up walls, and Great Wire Bugs send you soaring across the map faster than any other game in the series. Even the way the hub is designed plays into this. Check this out, the village looks like this. Every time you finish a quest, you'll be dropped here and presented with a choice. You can either go left and take on another quest, or you can go right and do something else. If you got the part you needed, you'll go right, arrive at the forge, and upgrade your gear a bit. Once you're done there, naturally, the very next thing you'll do is go on another quest. To do that, you'll simply turn around, walk 12 feet or 3.5 meters for the sane people of the world, and select your quest. Of course, you can't go on a quest without the proper gear and items, both of which can be found in a box immediately to your right. So head over there and grab the gear that best fits the quest. Finally, the last thing you need to do before embarking on practically any quest in these games is eat. And as you might have already guessed, that's right over here. Now zoom out and take a look at the path. Everything is structured in such a way that you'll constantly travel along this line until you have a reason to go right and do something else. This exists in the hub as well. Here's the return point, quest counter, equipment, food, and upgrades. You travel along this circle until you have a reason to leave it. All of these small changes and decisions are meant to ensure that you spend as much of your time in the core gameplay loop as possible. Fight monsters, make gear, repeat. Anything that doesn't directly contribute to those two isn't necessary here. Now, I already hear some of you yelling at the screen asking me to address the elephant in the room, but don't worry, we'll get there. First, we need to talk about the final two fundamental changes in the gameplay, the third and fourth ones that have been gradually reinventing the series, starting with wire bugs. I'm not sure you understand how wire bugs actually work. It's easy to think that they just make the hunter crazy powerful and let them fly around, but that totally misses what may be one of the most interesting mechanics I've ever seen in a game. We talked about how Monster Hunter loves experimentation, and using that experimentation to gradually improve the series. Wire bugs and the fourth change are Rise's experiments. I want to go in depth on wire bugs and take a look at their potential, whether or not they reached it, and their overall impact on the gameplay, while once again attempting to dispel some rumors and misconceptions along the way. First though, I want to talk about something that I feel is even more important and particularly relevant when it comes to changes like wire bugs. While Monster Hunter especially suffers from this problem, it goes well beyond this series and it's become almost impossible to avoid nowadays. Maybe it's just me, but I feel like gaming discourse has become profoundly negative and polarizing. I mean, look at the discourse surrounding Monster Hunter Rise and now Wilds. I'm not a huge fan of all that, and I believe that we need to do better than this thing is wholly and entirely bad while this thing is perfect, since that's basically never the case. Now, these videos take a staggeringly long time to make, yet I do it anyway partially because I love it, but also because I don't think discussions about games should be black and white, and if I can do something about that, I want to try. So if you want to support more nuanced and optimistic productions like this one, you can do so by joining my Patreon. Members get access to a more personal bonus video every month, behind the scenes posts and updates, early access to and longer director's cut versions of the normal YouTube videos, and your name in the credits at the end of each video. More than all of those special bonuses though, you're supporting an attempt to make this medium we all love just a little bit better for everyone involved, and that means the world to me. So thank you for the support. Now let's talk about wire bugs. But hold on, what is a wire bug? Well, I did say that they're one of the most interesting mechanics I've ever seen in a game, so as you'd expect, there's quite a lot to them. Because of that, I'd like to split them up into two different categories, movement and combat. Starting with movement, while on the ground, wire bugs let you jump up or dash horizontally. In the air, you have the same two options. This is expanded upon thanks to the ability to free aim your wire bugs while both on the ground and in the air. You can use this to execute some pretty precise movement outside of the basic up and straight. Finally, you can dangle midair by just holding onto a wire bug for a bit. Naturally, the hunter has new movement options to complement this, and the most important one is the air dodge. By inputting roll while airborne, you can do exactly that, flip in a direction of your choosing. Crucially, you can only do this once and it can be refreshed by using another wire bug. Now that probably sounds a lot more complicated than it actually is, but we can simplify it by thinking of wire bugs as a way to add verticality to the gameplay. Keep that idea in your folder, it's going to be extremely important moment later. Now we can look at combat. These are called Silkbind skills, and much like arts from Generations, they act like special moves that utilize wire bugs in various different ways. And I do mean various different ways. Some launch you into the air before you slam down with a powerful finisher, some fling you out of harm's way, some let you dodge through attacks, some act like parries, some... you get it. The key here is that all of these skills consume the same resource. Check out these two icons on the bottom of the screen. These are your wire bugs. Every skill uses at least one of them, and the cooldown of these skills changes based on which one you used. The especially powerful ones like the Dual Blades counter have significantly longer recharge times than more tame options like the Sword and Shield's Falling Shadow attack. These skills are further balanced by the fact that they use a different number of wire bugs depending on the skill. This is a critical detail, as if you rely on these skills too often, you might find yourself in a position where you need wire bugs for a counter or evasive maneuver, but simply don't have any because you just used them for one of your more impactful attacks. Finally, you've got one of the most powerful abilities in the game. The Wirefall. This is a special action that every weapon can execute. It launches you out of harm's way after getting hit, sheaths your weapon, and gives you control over your character again. However, it too requires a wire bug to activate, and it has a lengthy cooldown to match its utility. Furthermore, this mechanic isn't the get out of jail free card that it may at first seem to be, and we'll see why soon. So if we rewind a bit, we can notice an alarming detail, a detail that will lead us perfectly into that idea of this being a pure Monster Hunter game. It's especially easy to see when you think about this in terms of actions and resources. In a Zelda game, I might have a stamina meter, a health bar, a number of bombs and arrows, and maybe potions. Each of these uses a different resource. When shooting my bow, I don't have to consider how many bombs I have. The two are totally disconnected. In Rise, however, remember that these 2 or 3 wire bugs are responsible for all of your special attacks, which includes your buffs, counters, vertical movement, your high-speed horizontal movement, and your wirefalls. In short, your wire bugs are responsible for your movement, your offense, and your defense. This creates a really cool game of risk-reward where every time you choose to use a wire bug, you need to think multiple steps ahead. In previous Monster Hunter games, commitment was a key part of the combat. You had to consider where the monster would be by the time your attack came out, what that monster would be doing, and if you'd be able to get out of harm's way after your attack landed. Crucially, the foresight stopped there. In Rise, however, that foresight goes a step further. Now you still have to consider all of that, but you also have to think about what happens long after your attack. This might be hard to fully grasp, so let's look at an example. Imagine you're playing Charge Blade and the monster is really crashing out. It lands a hit, but you wirefall back in to keep up the pressure. You then use one of your most powerful Silkbind attacks, Counter Peak Performance. This skill maxes out your files and blocks exactly one attack. It even leads into a bunch of different follow-ups. However, in doing this, you just unknowingly sealed your fate. How so? Well, tragically, you used both of your wire bugs, and you forgot that this monster has an attack that requires a wirefall to evade. If this attack lands and you don't have any wire bugs, you're probably dead. Can you start to see this whole thinking multiple steps ahead idea now? You have to consider how many wire bugs you have at any given moment. You need to think about the monster's moveset and what they're capable of, and perhaps most importantly, you need to remember the cooldown on your wire bugs to ensure that you're never caught in a bad position without them. That level of foresight and predictions that have defined Monster Hunter's combat for so long are arguably even stronger here than they've ever been. Finally, we can look at rampages. This is going to be a shorter section since despite being arguably the second biggest addition to the game next to wire bugs, they're actually far less prevalent than you might think. Let's start with the basics. Rampages are these tower defense segments where you have to fend off a horde of monsters with siege weaponry. Occasionally, someone will hit a gong and your hunter will start putting up prime LeBron numbers for a short time. The rampages are pretty novel, and they're a great way to mix things up a bit. However, they're also almost entirely optional. In this most recent playthrough, I did 2 of them in low rank and 10 total. If you exclude rampage weapon grinding, that number drops all the way down to 5. Rampage weapons are cool, but they're also far from optimal, so it's not like you need to grind for them. This means that if you spend around 50 hours in Rise, which would already be relatively low, you'd only have to do 1 rampage every 10 hours. I actually really like the way this is set up. Rampages are necessary for the story, and I think they're great as a storytelling tool, but they are quite different from normal hunts. Making them borderline optional is a great way to allow players who don't necessarily enjoy them to just skip them for the most part. The biggest problem with this optional nature, though, is that you do need to complete rampages to unlock what I believe are some of the best monsters in the game. The Apexes. These powered up versions of normal monsters really push your abilities to their limits, and they're some of the most exciting and challenging hunts in the game, so it is a little unfortunate that you have to do rampages to unlock them. Alright, everything else to cover about rampages is story related, so throw that in a folder, we'll be back. Now that we have a good grasp of the fundamentals, Okay, fine, we'll talk about the birds. Speary birds are often considered the biggest problem in Rise, and while I could sit here and explain to you why artificially limiting your stats with small collectibles scattered across the map is a bad idea, I don't think that would be a particularly valuable use of our time. However, what I do think would be worthwhile is what I always do. Try to figure out why the developers made this choice. Speary birds are so obviously bad that I desperately wanted to understand what the devs were trying to do here, and in taking a step back and looking at the bigger picture, I've got a theory that I think makes sense. First off, we know that Rise was a game that was meant to be played in short bursts, much like the older portable Monster Hunter games. It was deliberately streamlined so that you could focus entirely on fighting monsters. At a glance then, Speary birds seem completely antithetical to this goal, but what if they were actually trying to help make the game more streamlined? Hear me out. Speary birds are a form of difficulty scaling. They're meant to challenge veterans and give newer players an option to increase specific stats if they find a hunt too challenging. This idea already existed in previous Monster Hunter games thanks to weapon and armor skills. Things like defense up and health boost did the exact same thing that Speary birds do. The only difference is that they had to be equipped before a hunt. In the case of post-world games, you can go to your tent and create specific builds for them, but even then, you can't make decorations in your tent. The goal of Speary birds was to cut this out. That way, if you were ever in a hunt and you felt the monster was hitting a bit too hard or wasn't taking enough damage, you don't have to abandon and remake your build or throw together something in your tent with the scraps that you had lying around. You could instead run around the map for a bit, get a little stronger, and try again. So backwards as it may seem, Speary birds were probably meant to streamline hunts even further. That said, this obviously didn't work, and they addressed this problem in Sunbreak, but it is yet another interesting case of this series experimenting and trying new things. Sometimes they hit, sometimes they miss. Regardless, I'm glad they're willing to take the shot, since to me, that experimentation is a large part of what makes Monster Hunter special. Okay, with that out of the way, we need to look at potential, since it's here that we can start to go back and expand on a lot of those "we'll get there in a second" things that we kept running into. The question we need to answer is, does Monster Hunter Rise reach its potential? Grab that folder from earlier. Wirebugs introduced a level of verticality that's not the right folder. I meant the one about verticality. Yeah, that one. Sorry, that's on me. I should have been more clear. Wirebugs introduced a level of verticality that we only saw glimpses of in previous games with weapons like Insect Glaive and the relatively limited aerial style from Generations in GU. With this comes a responsibility to capitalize on that verticality and design the game around it. You see, in the past, every attack in the game had to be avoidable by moving somewhere on the X or Z axis. This is a bit difficult to explain and hard to show on a 2D screen, especially when you're a terrible artist like myself, but basically I'm saying attacks need to be avoidable by either running left and right or forward and back. If an attack was a giant unblockable wave that cut across the entire field, it would be completely unavoidable by anyone not using the Insect Glaive. That would obviously be problematic since there are 13 other weapons in the game. However, with Wirebugs, you can safely assume that all 13 of these weapons have a way to get into the air now, so you can actually design attacks and monsters around that idea. Wirebugs add counters too though. How does the game address those? Well, to frequent viewers of the channel, I have to apologize since this is probably the 50th time you've heard me say this, but considering I still see people claiming that counters in this series are broken, and since this is one of the most fundamental parts of Rise's gameplay, I'll have to go over it again. Don't worry, I'll be quick this time. Counters are the solution to what may at first seem like an overpowered ability from the hunter. Monsters in this game have multiple follow-up attacks that'll punish players who counter without thinking about what attack is coming next. See? Told you I'd be quick. This goes a step further with wirefalls. These too sound broken at a glance, but when you consider that wirefalling removes the iframes that you'd normally have when on the ground, you quickly realize that while powerful, it's nowhere near as game-breaking as it seems. Finally, the hunter's mobility and the Silkbind skills together grant them a level of speed and fluidity that haven't existed in the series prior or even since. Yet once again, the monsters have a way of countering this with their own speed. You'll recognize this almost immediately if you go from playing late game Rise and Sunbreak, then switch back to World. It feels almost like the game is moving in slow motion. Rise's combat revolves around these ideas: verticality, follow-ups, and speed. One of our biggest challenges here is actually teaching the player all of this, but Rise handles this perfectly with its first few monsters. Now, would you believe me if I told you can learn all 3 of these lessons from a single monster? Well, better yet, you can learn almost all of them from just one single attack. Check this out. This is Grady Zuchi, and for its most powerful attack, it calls its friends and they all perform 3 spins back to back before finishing with a tail slam. Now let's look at what this teaches us. First, we've got verticality. As you might expect, the horizontal range on this attack is massive thanks to the 2 smaller Izuchis on the sides. Depending on your positioning, this is quite similar to that hypothetical wave attack from earlier. However, if timed correctly, you can simply jump over it and even counter it if you use the right skills. This teaches us that there will be attacks in the game with enormous horizontal range that can be circumvented defended by going vertical. Next is the counter. The tailspin is blockable, but if you drop your guard or counter anything outside of the last hit, you'll get punished for it. Wire falling is just as dangerous. This attack doesn't last long enough to wire fall into it, however, thanks to both the amount of follow-ups this monster has and its friends that shadow nearly all of its movements, you're likely to get hit a second time if you wire fall carelessly. Finally, there's speed. This is a more general lesson that nearly every monster in the game is going to teach you, but it's especially true with a monster like Izuchi who can leap off walls, flip through the air, and of course, throw out its patented tailspin. Now, what's especially cool about the early game monsters in Rise is that they all have some kind of lesson they're trying to teach the player. It's not just the first one. Somnicanth, for example, does have that exact hypothetical attack that sends an unblockable wave across the field. You can run away when it does this, but by far the most practical way to avoid it is by jumping over it. The monster even pauses for a while to give you a chance to sheath your weapon if you don't already have a Silkbind attack that sends you into the air. Roggy and Baggy both teach you about poison and sleep respectively, while Volvidon and Legambi teach you about paralysis and speed. Volvidon is a monster that's almost too fast to chase down, so you have to figure out ways to deal with this boss that's constantly outspeeding you. Legambi, on the other hand, doesn't move around quite as much, but it does show us that knowledge is more important than reaction time in this game. There's one attack where Legambi pauses for a moment before darting forward. If you wait for the dash animation to start, there's almost no way you'll be able to react in time depending on your distance and your weapon. Knowing this, you may choose to keep your distance to ensure that you always have time to react to whatever it's about to do. These burst options train the player to fight with a level of caution, something that you'll have to do for most late game monsters. So this is great, right? The monsters are designed around the new verticality granted to the player, they all have super aggressive combos to punish wire falls and reckless counters, and they all match the newfound speed of the hunter. Well, not quite. A handful of monsters do fall into this category. Magnamalo, Tigrex, Almudron, and Gossarog, just to name a few. But the majority of the time, especially early and middle game, monsters do struggle to keep up. Basically every monster in this game has follow-ups. Unfortunately though, a lot of the counters from the hunter are so fast or safe that the monster doesn't have time to punish you. Equally, while verticality does exist, you're rarely forced to utilize it like that one Somnicanth attack. This is especially disappointing considering that's one of the most significant changes in the game. There's a bit more to potential, but we'll have to put a pin in that for now since explaining it would spoil the story. So toss it in a folder, label that folder with the word Allmother, that way we don't mix it up this time, and hold on to it for later. With all that said, while Rise might not reach 100% of its potential, it shows flashes of what could be. More than that though, Rise feels like a return to form in a lot of ways. This is especially true outside of the gameplay. I mean, just look at the overly saturated elements and designs. The game has that more cartoonish feel to it once again that existed pre-world, and even the weapon designs here are back to that more over-the-top look that made it feel like you were carrying a part of the monster with you after defeating it. All of this contributes to the idea that Rise still has those key fundamental principles that have always defined Monster Hunter. Furthermore, thanks to how refined the gameplay loop is here, the game ends up feeling almost like a perfectly distilled version of the series' core values, like a pure Monster Hunter game. If you've ever practiced and studied basically any medium that involves some level of storytelling, you've surely heard the phrase show don't tell. If not, the long and short of it is that you should aim to express the feeling you're trying to convey through actions more than words. The example I always love to use in games is Malenia. You don't need to read the lore to understand that this character is insanely powerful. It's directly demonstrated to you in the gameplay when she kills you 1,000 times. Show don't tell has basically been the glue that holds Monster Hunter's stories together, and it's something that Rise excels at. So allow me to show you what I mean. No? Too corny? I mean, I don't know, I thought it was kind of smooth. You know what, let me just move on. Despite its colorful exterior, Rise is a dark game. That probably sounds like a joke, considering when you eat you get this cutscene. But I promise this is serious business. Check it out, there are 4 main characters in Monster Hunter Rise, and the interactions between these 4 don't just dictate the events of the game, they create some of the most interesting stories in the series. Those 4 are Kamara Village, the Hunter, the Thunder Serpents, and Magnamalo. In short, the Serpents cause the rampage, the Hunter and Magnamalo fight the rampage, and Kamara Village needs to be protected from the rampage. It's a rather simple story. From that quick synopsis alone though, you might already notice some cool details, and don't worry, we'll cover all of it. Let's start with the 2 most relevant forces, Kamara and the Rampage. As we do, I want you to keep this word in mind. the word is contrast if you're not looking at the screen. It's a long video, I get it. Just lock in and win your Valo match, you got this. That word defines the interactions between these two. Kamura has been fighting the Rampage for decades, long before the events of the game take place. Naturally, they've become incredibly adept at doing this as well. They've got structures in place, both offensive and defensive, that are meant to fend off the horde and keep the village safe. Said village is one of the most lively in the series, and the game makes a point to show that off right from the start. There's such a lighthearted and jubilant feel to this place. The cats hammering away at the comically long dongo, the constant movement of the villagers, and the workers diligently maintaining the forge causing fire to erupt from the dragon's head on the buildings all make it feel like the village is in a constant state of celebration. It's a village that's overflowing with life, with excitement, with... This place is simply called the Shrine Ruins, and it's given the title Sanctuary Abandoned by the Gods. Its true name has been lost to time, but we know that, much like Kamura, humans did live here once. Yet now it lies lifeless and abandoned, haunted by the monsters that call this place home. We don't know exactly what happened to the Shrine Ruins, but it's very heavily implied that the serpents Narwa and Ibushi were responsible. This is how Rise tells its story. It takes you from this bustling village filled with life, then tosses you into a chilling reminder of what that very same village will look like if you fail in your mission. If this had been Wilds or World, you would have arrived at the ruins and been forced to stop at the stone structure as your handler goes,
"Hunter, look at these rock formations. They don't seem natural, but then who could have built this? Better yet, what happened to them?"
Then you'd reach the gates of the old buildings, the camera would zoom in and they'd stop you once again to say,
"The structures here look totally abandoned. Whoever made that gate was probably responsible for these too. You don't think Kamura could end up like this too one day, do you? We should keep moving. We have to get to the bottom of this."
Then you'd approach a shrine and you get it. The game doesn't need to say any of this. It respects you enough to go,
"Look, Hunter, you figure out how to buy the game, turn on the console, get past the character creation, and select a quest. You've probably got enough brain cells to connect the dots here."
Furthermore, this method of storytelling through the environment instead of expositional dialogue allows these ideas to remain in your mind through each and every hunt. There are ruins everywhere in this game. The flooded forest has a dilapidated pyramid, there are stone ruins of buildings in the desert, and the Frost Islands have abandoned bridges and shrines. Nearly every map in this game has constant reminders of why these hunts matter, why it's so important that you succeed against these forces that threaten the village. Yet nowhere is this better represented than in the Rampage. It's in these sections that we're asked to directly prevent the very thing that we've been shown time and time again. The setting here is phenomenal. These constant drums that emulate the marching horde of monsters that are gradually and inevitably approaching create a very palpable tension that only builds as the Rampage progresses. The colors here are arguably even more impressive though. Look at the contrast between this area and the rest of the game. Rise is defined by its more saturated, bright, and colorful style, but this area is dark and muted. It's claustrophobic and stands as this inherently uncomfortable and uncontrollable challenge that you absolutely must overcome. This is represented in the gameplay as well. Go ahead and grab that Rampage folder. Rampages are frustrating to complete. You're stuck to these stationary platforms while multiple monsters attack you from all sides, the most annoying of which will simply ignore you and make a mad dash for the gate. Fighting on foot isn't much of a solution either though, since these games have always been designed around fighting one-on-one. Here you'll be faced with half a dozen monsters at the same time. You just can't do that on foot without the special gong from earlier, and even then it's still a bit of a mess. All of this together heightens that frantic feeling of impending disaster that lurks behind each and every Rampage. Failing quests in Monster Hunter has always been unique compared to a lot of other games, since canonically you can fail. You can lose a fight, come back, patch yourself up, prep for round 2, and try again. With the Rampages though, you don't get that luxury. Failure here means the monsters get to Kamura. Failure here means the village you once called home becomes another forgotten relic lost to time. This is why the contrast between Kamura and the Rampage is so great. They act like these two mirror images that perfectly represent why the hunters in these games do what they do. But speaking of those hunters, they're one of the other main characters here. So let's look at them, and more importantly their rival, Magnamalo. Every Monster Hunter game has a rival and a main antagonist. In 4, your rival is Gormagala and your antagonist is Shigaru, maybe Dalamador depending on how you define it. In World, your rival is Nergigante and your antagonist is Xeno'jiva. Your rival in Rise might be my personal favorite though. But okay, wait a second, where is this rival idea coming from? What makes Magnamalo a rival to the hunter instead of just a normal monster? Well, rivals tend to be anti-heroes too. Think Zuko from Avatar or Silver from Pokemon. These are characters who often clash with the protagonist, but not necessarily because their goals are mutually exclusive, more so because they have fundamentally different worldviews. See, the protagonist and antagonist are kind of like two forces going in opposite directions that meet at the center. For one to move forward, the other must fall. There's no other way. Rivals, on the other hand, move alongside each other, occasionally clashing and always pursuing a similar goal that doesn't necessitate the other's failure. Zuko in Avatar was trying to capture Aang, but his true goal was to restore his honor and grow into his own person. Aang didn't need to fail in his mission for that to happen. Ozai, the main antagonist, had the goal of ruling the world. To do that, Aang had to go. There was no other way to rule the world if the Avatar was in the way. I bring this up because Magnamalo fits more into that first role than the second. This monster doesn't cause or lead the rampage. It shows up here because there are a ton of confused monsters gathered in one spot causing a bunch of chaos. For a monster as powerful as Magnamalo, that's just free food. In a way then, Magnamalo and the Hunter are both working against the rampage, just in their own ways. Think about it, if you're a monster in this horde and you see either of these two, you're probably cooked. This is where we can start to see that anti-hero idea and the lack of mutual exclusivity. Magnamalo can terrorize the rampage as much as it wants, yet ultimately its goal is to simply find the biggest meal it can. It's not malicious, and its existence isn't inherently dangerous in any way as long as you leave it alone. The true cause of the rampage lies in our antagonist, the final boss of the game and the one that actively threatens to destroy not just Kamura, but the ecosystem itself. The Elder Dragons, Narwa and Ibushi. The difference between a rival like Magnamalo and a true antagonist like the Serpents is their endgame goals. Magnamalo's endgame is survival. His methods are brutal, and he's obviously an extremely dangerous monster, but his existence isn't actively threatening to the ecosystem. Narwa and Ibushi are exactly that. By their very nature, they threaten the entire surrounding area and maybe even the world. Like I said before, these two are probably responsible for what happened to the Shrine Ruins. Furthermore, they're the direct cause of the rampage. It's stated in-game that Ibushi is so powerful, his mere presence causes a mass migration of monsters scrambling to get as far away as possible. That's the rampage. Every monster in the area looks up, sees a giant snake in the sky tossing trees like they're made of paper mache, and goes, actually, I think I prefer being alive, and full sprints in the opposite direction. Naturally then, by defeating these two, you'll stop the rampage once and for all. So that's exactly what you do. You find Ibushi causing a rampage, confront him, and he flees the scene. That's fine, because when we fight Narwa, that'll put an end to... Wait, is that seriously how the game ends? Well, if you played at launch, yes, it really did end like that. There was one final cutscene after defeating Narwa. The twins said some super cryptic and concerning stuff that let us know the Serpents are very much alive, and nothing. I want to be clear, depending on the day of the week, Monster Hunter Rise is my favorite game of all time. Most of the criticism levied against it I find to be either misguided, slightly unfair, or unsubstantial. Most of the criticism. This, however, is borderline unforgivable, and not just because of what it meant for Rise at launch, but because of what it means for the series going forward. Rise came out in 2021, meaning a portion of its development happened during this year. I wonder if anything significant happened during this year. Now, if its launch was an anomaly, the exception to the rule, this part of the video wouldn't even exist. What kills me is that Wilds did the very same thing, despite the fact that 2024 did not have that one really specific event from 2020 that I don't want to say because of the unspeakable things YouTube will do to me if I do. What makes this even more complicated though is what happens next. The title updates. For so much of this video, I've been hinting at things, telling incomplete stories, and saying we'll get there later, and this is why. Without the title updates, you could make a pretty strong argument that Rise was a bad Monster Hunter game, but with them, it's in contention for the best. Let's start with the story, the full version this time. The way the story is expanded and ultimately finished in the title updates make it my personal favorite base game story. The reason for this is due to how well it develops and enhances all of those ideas that we mentioned earlier. It starts with us hunting a bunch of Elder Dragons, and right off the bat, we get Magnamalo cementing his place as one of the greatest rivals in the series. So when you fight these Elders, you'll notice a familiar face on the map. As the fight progresses, he may even stop by to help you out. What makes this especially impactful is the fact that Magnamalo is punching well above his weight here. This is a vast oversimplification for the sake of brevity, but know that there are basically two types of monsters in this series: Elder Dragons and non-Elder Dragons. Elders are considered to be a tremendous threat to the local environment and a tier above normal monsters. Monsters that are capable of standing up to Elder Dragons are exceedingly rare, and monsters that can actually beat them are even rarer still. But Magnamalo does not concern himself with titles or statistics. He simply sees Elders as a large source of energy and does this to them. These are the most challenging bosses in the game up to this point, so you may have these moments where you're on the ropes and really struggling to handle the overwhelming power that they possess. To then have this monster that you once considered to be your primary antagonist effectively change sides and pop in to lend a hand almost feels like those moments from a show or a movie where the rival and hero have to team up to stop a threat that's too powerful for either of them to handle alone. Funny enough, that's actually exactly what happens later on, in the fight that puts Magnamalo just a hair above every other rival in this series for me, the showdown with All-Mother Narwa. Let me give you a quick refresher on the context of this fight. Narwa and Ibushi have been trying to meet up after finding each other on Monsters Only. This meeting would be catastrophic since their plan is to wipe the land clean and create a paradise for their offspring. They even outright say,
"Let us form our final bond to rule the world and all beyond."
if just two of them were enough to cause the rampage, imagine the chaos and destruction dozens could create. It's a scenario that must be prevented at all costs. These are the stakes, but the actual events of the fight are nothing short of pure cinema. You arrive at the battlefield only to find Ibushi alone, and the gargantuan hole that Narwa fell through mysteriously patched up, but we won't think about that too much. The showdown is cut short when he falls through the ground and into a new arena, where Narwa, his queen, lies in wait. It becomes clear that Ibushi doesn't have much left, and so he offers the last of his power to Narwa in one final desperate attempt to defeat the Hunter. This creates Narwa the All-Mother, a version of the Thunder Serpent that's capable of using the abilities of both Narwa and Ibushi together. She's effectively two Elder Dragons in one, and likely the single most dangerous being in the game up to this point. This is demonstrated in her fight where she'll utilize these new abilities to their maximum potential, sending forth waves of enhanced lightning and supplementing her base moveset with new follow-ups and wind attacks from Ibushi. She'll even use electromagnetism to unearth Dragonators that she'll spin around the arena. But despite all this power, there's a monster that doesn't care about titles and statistics. Magnamalo was drawn to the enormous amount of energy generated by Narwa, and upon arriving, wastes no time at all. He looks down at the chasm, realizes where that energy is coming from, and instead of demonstrating even an ounce of self-preservation by turning in the opposite direction, he jumps down to fight it. It's at this point that I'd like to pause and remind you that this is a normal monster. Obviously Magnamalo gets folded like an omelet, but this causes a wyvern ride that sees the two of you team up against this world-ending threat, triggering proof of a hero to signify your inevitable victory. This is probably my favorite moment in the base game. It feels like the perfect way to end the story. The title updates didn't just finish the story though. They gave the gameplay a second chance to reach its full potential. Go ahead and grab the All-Mother folder from earlier. I would argue that there's only one other monster in the base game that utilizes wire bugs better than All-Mother Narwa does. This boss really stresses those ideas of verticality and counter-counters. She's got these special attacks that create pillars of wind that you can use to jump out of the way of larger AoEs like this massive beam. She's also got abilities that send rocks into the air much like base Narwa, but now there's a more strict timer on how long they'll stay in the air for. What's especially clever about these platforms is the fact that they have ballistae and cannons just like the rampages. If you utilize these well enough, you can knock the dragon down and prevent her ult from going off, an ult that you can otherwise avoid by using, you guessed it, verticality. Even knocking the boss down creates an opportunity for more verticality as her biggest weak point is elevated, forcing you to either climb or jump to hit it. More than anything, All-Mother Narwa is a boss that tries to combine the two biggest changes from the base game, wire bugs and rampages, and test you on both of them to see what you've learned. For the most part, this works. It's far from perfect, and the implementation can be pretty clunky and even forced at times, but as a whole, it's executed well enough for what it's trying to do. I could talk more about... oh no. Valstrax is without question the best boss in base Monster Hunter Rise. It felt like you could almost see the developers learning how to deal with all of these complex systems in real time as the game went on. As I said, a lot of these monsters in the base game just couldn't keep up with the abilities of the Hunter. All-Mother Narwa felt like a boss that finally figured it out, but went a bit too far in some aspects. Valstrax, however, feels perfect. It's a boss that has endless counter-counters, and by far the highest speed in the game. It even rewards the player for utilizing their verticality and their wire bugs. As the cherry on top of all of this, it's got maybe the single greatest attack in the series as far as spectacles go. I struggle to think of even a single attack this boss can do that doesn't have a follow-up. The double wing stab into the ground, or the horizontal thrust that can go into either a second stab or a spin. On the topic of that spin, does it look familiar in any way? It's exactly like Izushi's, just much, much bigger. However, it too can be dodged by launching into the air, once again promoting that more vertical focused combat that Rise has access to. It's got attacks that are reminiscent of Lagambi, with movement that's similar to Volvidon. Remember that that charge attack that Legambi could do? Valstrax has a few of those as well. It's got rockets in its wings that it can use to blast forward at terrifying speeds far faster than a human can react. So much like Legambi, you have to act preemptively. Volvidon rolled around the arena as you fought it, forcing you to be patient and strike at just the right moment. Valstrax takes advantage of its jets to rocket around the battlefield and force you to do the very same thing. Wait for just the right moment to strike. It even uses mechanics from later monsters like Gossarag and Magnamalo. It has a charging animation where if you land enough hits on the chest, you can cause a burst of damage and knock it down. This is nearly identical to Magnamalo's Hellfire that, if you target the same spot enough, causes a burst of damage and a knockdown. It's even got attacks that you have to wirefall out of, forcing you to consider how many wire bugs you have and when to use them. Finally, the attack that defines Valstrax, its signature move, Seize It. Actually, you know what? Let me just show you. I could go on and on about this monster all day, but the point is this: Valstrax feels like a culmination of everything the bosses in this game have taught you up to this point, yet even more importantly, it's a boss that asks the player to utilize the full extent of their arsenal to overcome one final test. While Narwa felt like the perfect conclusion to the game's narrative and the Rampage storyline, Valstrax feels like the final chapter of Rise itself, and of everything that made this game so special in the first place. The fast and fluid vertical combat, the one-of-a-kind and more supernatural creatures, and of course, the dramatic and over-the-top presentation that defined the entire game from start to finish. It's all beautifully represented here in one final fight. Because of its launch state, and because of how this series has evolved since World, Monster Hunter is becoming harder and harder to properly judge. Should I call Wilds a bad game because it launched in the state that it did, or should I praise it for eventually becoming the greatest base game we've ever seen? Should I lambast World for starting trends like microtransactions and a more live service nature, or should I applaud its ability to bring the series to a totally new audience and breathe new life into these games that I've loved for so long? I really do mean it when I say I do not know. At launch, Rise was pretty undeniably rough around the edges to say the least, and that garnered quite a negative reputation. Yet equally responsible for this reputation was the fact that it wasn't World 2. The game's responsible for some of the criticisms levied against it, but for every valid critique, there exist a dozen that feel akin to giving an Italian restaurant a bad review because they didn't serve authentic avocado tostadas. None of this even covers the expansion, which I'll go over in another video since, yeah, we don't need this one to be twice as long as it already is. Recently, it's become increasingly difficult to make definitive judgments on Monster Hunter games, but I can tell you this: there is no Monster Hunter game quite like Rise. No others capture that feeling that the old games were able to provide while bringing the series into the modern era. None have combat as dynamic and experimental, and perhaps most importantly, none have such a tremendous contrast between how they were initially received and how special they actually were. Sure, the title updates added a lot, but the overwhelming heart of this game was on full display from day one. To anyone who's capable of seeing that heart, that brilliant, vibrant, and expressive heart, Rise might just be the most underrated Monster Hunter game.